Deion Sanders apparently upset with Tim McCarver's criticisms of his two-sport day last Sunday. Felt like he would gain a measure of revenge, not with champagne, but by dousing McCarver with 4 tubs of ice water. McCarver was furious. So was CBS Sports. Rick Gentile, their producer, complained to National League President Bill White last night. McCarver wants a meeting with White as soon as he can get one. And after this confrontation, Tim McCarver confronted Sanders.
You are a real man, Deion, I'll say that.
The tragic truth about Tim McCarver has been sitting in plain sight for years, and almost nobody saw it coming. His wife finally broke her silence. She shared what the cameras never showed: the twisted fingers, the hidden pain, the slow and private unraveling of a man who once stood in front of millions and explained the most complicated game in the world like it was the simplest thing he had ever done. You clicked this video because the title promised something terrifying. Here is what you need to know right away. The terrifying part is real, but it is not what you think. The tragedy of Tim McCarver is not just about how he died. It is about how he lived. It is about where he started, what he was handed, and the enormous distance he covered between the boy he was born into and the man he chose to become. This is not just a death story. This is one of the most remarkable change stories that American sports has ever produced. And it all begins in a city that shaped him in ways he would spend the rest of his life working to undo. Before we go any further into this story, here is the real question at the center of everything you are about to hear. How does a child raised inside one of the most rigidly segregated cities in America grow up to become a bridge between two worlds that had spent generations refusing to trust each other? How does inherited hatred become genuine, lifelong friendship? How does a kid who flinched at the idea of sharing a drink with a black teammate end up spending 50 years honoring that teammate as a brother? And how does a backup catcher from Memphis eventually become the most recognized voice in the history of the Fall Classic? If this story is already pulling you forward, go ahead and give this video some hype right now. The hype feature is right below this video. Use it. It takes 1 second and it tells the platform that this story deserves a wider audience. It means everything for getting this in front of people who need to hear it. Now, let us talk about what his wife revealed, and then let us work all the way back to the beginning. Tim McCarver passed away on February 16, 2023, in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 81 years old. He died of heart failure, surrounded by his family, in the same city where his entire life story had started. In the months that followed his passing, his wife, Ann McDaniel, and other members of his family began sharing details that had never been made public. The picture they painted was not one of sudden collapse. It was one of long and quiet endurance. McCarver had been dealing with declining health since 2020. That was the real reason he stepped away from the Cardinals broadcast booth during the COVID-19 pandemic. Most people watching from the outside assumed it was caution, a reasonable decision for a man in his late 70s during a global health crisis. The truth was heavier than that. What his family revealed in the period after his death was the physical toll that 2 decades of professional catching had extracted from his body, not just during his playing years, but across the entire arc of his life that followed. His fingers, after a career spent crouching behind home plate and stopping fastballs and breaking balls with his bare hands, were described by those closest to him as twisted and torn. That damage had not appeared suddenly in his final years. It had accumulated over time, slowly, quietly. He had been living with chronic pain for a long time before the public had any idea. He had sat in broadcast booths across every major network in America, next to partners and producers, and in front of millions of viewers, and he had smiled and talked and taught and analyzed, and almost none of them had known how much it was costing him physically just to be present. That detail alone should tell you something important about the kind of man Tim McCarver was. He did not perform suffering. He performed excellence, even when suffering was real and constant. His return to Memphis in his final years was not random or incidental. It was deliberate. It was a closing of the circle. The city that had installed the earliest and most broken versions of his beliefs became the place where he chose to spend his final days. He did not run from where he came from. He went back to it. And understanding why he did that requires understanding everything that happened in between. Now, the key figures in the Tim McCarver story are going to be introduced in reverse order in this video. We are starting with the last major collision of his career and working our way back to where everything started. Each person on this list changed him in some fundamental way. Each encounter cost him something or built something inside him, or both. Every one of them is a chapter in the larger story of what it looks like to keep growing long after most people have decided they are finished changing. But first, you need to understand the city that built the original Tim McCarver, because nothing that comes after makes sense without it. Memphis, Tennessee in the 1940s and 1950s was not simply a southern city with racial tension. It was a city where racial separation was written into law, enforced by institutions, and treated as a basic feature of how the world was supposed to operate. The schools were segregated, the public spaces were segregated, the social hierarchies were maintained by every official structure available. McCarver grew up inside all of that. His father was a Memphis police officer. In that city, in that era, law enforcement was one of the primary mechanisms through which the racial order was kept in place. McCarver was not growing up at the edges of that system. He was growing up at the center of it. What that environment produced was a young man who was technically excellent at the sport he loved and who had almost no framework for understanding the people standing right next to him on a baseball field. When the St. Louis Cardinals signed him out of high school in 1959, he was 17 years old. He was a teenager. He had spent his entire conscious life inside a world that had told him, through every institution and every social signal available, that the separation between black and white Americans was simply the way things were. The prejudices he carried were not personal inventions. They were the default output of a default system. That context does not excuse what he carried, but it does explain it. And the explanation matters because the story of what happened next is about what people can do when the default is finally challenged. When the comfortable distance of a lifetime of segregation collapses overnight, and you are suddenly sharing a clubhouse, a dugout, and a game with people you had spent your entire life being taught not to see. The St. Louis Cardinals of the 1960s were not a typical baseball franchise. They were something closer to an active social experiment. The team included Bob Gibson, Curt Flood, and Bill White, black players who had no intention of making white teammates comfortable in their prejudice. The culture of that clubhouse demanded confrontation. It did not offer the option of quiet accommodation. If you walked in carrying the biases of a segregated upbringing, you were going to be challenged on them, directly, by people who had every reason to be done waiting. Player number 5 in this story is Deion Sanders. The year was 1992. The month was October. The Atlanta Braves were in the middle of the National League Championship Series, fighting for the right to go to the World Series. Deion Sanders was playing outfield for those Braves. He was also playing cornerback for the Atlanta Falcons in the National Football League. Sanders was the kind of athlete who came along once in a generation, talented enough and bold enough to attempt things other people would not even consider. And on October 11th, 1992, he decided to attempt something that had almost never been tried at the professional level. He was going to play in an NFL game in Miami for the Falcons, and then travel to Pittsburgh to appear in an NLCS game for the Braves on the exact same calendar day. Tim McCarver was calling the NLCS for CBS. He was one of the most prominent broadcast voices in baseball at that moment, nationally recognized for one thing above everything else: saying exactly what he believed on live television, regardless of who was listening or what it might cost him. When he heard what Sanders was planning, he did not search for careful language or diplomatic framing. He went on air and said it clearly and directly. He called the move unacceptable. He called it a breach of contract to the Braves' teammates, who were depending on Sanders to be fully committed to their pennant run. He said that what Sanders was attempting during the most critical stretch of the baseball season was not boldness. It was ego dressed up as ambition. To understand why McCarver felt this so strongly, you have to understand the culture that raised him as a player. He had been shaped inside the St. Louis Cardinals clubhouse of the 1960s, an environment where loyalty to your team was not a preference or a suggestion. It was the foundation of everything. In that culture, you did not split your focus during a pennant chase. You did not pursue personal milestones when your teammates were counting on every ounce of your attention and energy. That was not merely a philosophy for McCarver. It was a code he had lived inside during the best years of his playing life, and Sanders, from inside that framework, was violating it in the most visible and deliberate way possible. Sanders was not the kind of man who absorbed criticism without a response. When the Braves won Game 7 and captured the pennant, he found his moment. Right in the middle of a live post-game interview on national television, while the cameras were rolling and the country was watching, Sanders walked up to McCarver and emptied 3 buckets of ice water directly over his head, one after another, all 3. McCarver's response became one of the most replayed moments in the history of sports broadcasting. Standing there soaking wet in the middle of a live national audience, he stared at Sanders and said, "You are a real man, Deion." I'll say that. It was sarcasm and composure and defiance, all collapsed into a single sentence. And it was exactly what the moment called for. Sanders later told the media that McCarver had falsified information about him and that the criticism had caused real damage to his family. McCarver did not walk anything back. He did not offer an apology or soften what he had said. He had spoken what he believed to be true, publicly, on purpose. That was the only way he knew how to operate. The Deion Sanders incident became famous because of its theater, but it was not an anomaly. It was Tim McCarver doing what Tim McCarver had always done and would continue to do. Player number 4 in this story is Bobby Valentine. And this chapter cost McCarver the most stable and long-running job of his entire broadcasting career. After 16 consecutive seasons as the primary broadcast voice of the New York Mets, McCarver was fired in February of 1999. 16 seasons. That is not a small commitment. That is not a fringe contributor being quietly shown the door. That is the established voice of a major franchise being let go, and the reason why the decision was made tells you everything about the tension that exists between honest analysis and the expectations of the organization footing the broadcast bill. McCarver had developed an ongoing pattern of public disagreement with Mets manager Bobby Valentine over in-game tactical decisions. Baseball managers, like most people who hold authority over a complex operation, do not love being contradicted on live television in front of millions of viewers. McCarver seemed genuinely unconcerned with that dynamic. He called what he saw. If a decision looked wrong to him, he named it. If the team was underperforming, he said so. If a strategic move appeared questionable to his experienced eye, he questioned it out loud without softening the language. The Mets had a different idea of what they wanted their broadcast to sound like. They wanted support. They wanted warmth. They wanted the kind of broadcast relationship that made the franchise look good even during difficult stretches. McCarver had built his entire professional identity around a principle that was directly opposed to that desire. He believed the viewer deserved honest analysis, not marketing dressed up as commentary, and he was not going to change that for anyone. There was also a money component to the situation. McCarver was earning $500,000 per year at the time, and the Mets were negotiating a new local network agreement and looking for ways to reduce their overall costs. Beyond the finances, his massive national presence on Fox had made him a figure who was sometimes larger than the local broadcast itself. That is a complicated dynamic for any franchise. When the national star and the local broadcast are the same person, the local broadcast sometimes disappears inside the larger reputation. The Mets brought in Tom Seaver to replace him. Seaver was the most beloved player in franchise history, a man whose name carried warmth and loyalty and the memory of the team's greatest years. The message of the hire was obvious. They were choosing home over honesty. They were choosing familiarity over the discomfort of being told difficult truths in front of their own fans. McCarver was hired by the New York Yankees almost immediately. He did not stop working. He did not retreat or recalibrate. He kept going because stopping was never something he had learned to do. Player number 3 in this story is Steve Carlton. By the mid-1970s, McCarver was no longer the young starting catcher he had once been. His best statistical years as a hitter were behind him. He had been traded and moved through several organizations, increasingly playing a backup role. Most players who reach that stage of a career fade out gradually. McCarver found a different path entirely. In 1975, Phillies manager Danny Ozark made a pairing decision that would become one of the most examined and debated tactical choices in the long history of the Philadelphia Phillies. He put veteran catcher McCarver together with left-handed pitcher Steve Carlton, who was known throughout baseball simply as Lefty. The results showed up quickly. Carlton had a slider that was one of the most effective pitches in the game. For those who need a quick explanation, a slider is a pitch that breaks sharply and horizontally as it approaches home plate. Carlton's slider was not just good, it was notoriously hard to handle, both for hitters trying to lay off it and for catchers trying to receive it properly. Most catchers at the big league level struggled to position their bodies in a way that helped umpires recognize Carlton's slider as a strike. McCarver did not struggle with it. Through years of experience and close attention, he had developed an almost instinctive understanding of how Carlton's pitch moved and how to position himself to catch it in a way that made the umpire's job easier. This is what modern analysts call pitch framing, a skill that was not yet named or measured in the 1970s, but whose effects were completely real. When McCarver caught for Carlton, the pitcher performed at a different level. By 1976, McCarver was catching essentially every game that Carlton started. Carlton won 20 games that year. The Phillies made the playoffs. The results were hard to argue with. The partnership became so well known that it generated a joke that circulated for years in baseball circles. People said that Carlton and McCarver would eventually be buried 60 feet and 6 inches apart from each other. That is the exact distance between the pitcher's rubber and home plate. That is how completely the two men's identities had been fused together in the sport's cultural memory. The arrangement pushed McCarver's career well into his late 30s. He was no longer valued for his overall performance across a full season. He was valued for one very specific thing: his ability to make the best pitcher on the roster perform at his highest level. That is a narrow lane, but it was real and it was demonstrably effective, and it kept him in the major leagues long after almost anyone would have predicted he would still be there. The controversy was also real and it ran deep. The Phillies already had a primary starting catcher in Bob Boone, who was younger, more durable, and a Gold Glove caliber defender. Critics argued consistently that pairing McCarver with Carlton every 4 or 5 days weakened the team overall, pulling a superior catcher out of the lineup and replacing him with an aging veteran whose offensive contributions were declining. The debate touched something fundamental about how teams should be built. Do you put your 9 best players on the field every day? Or do you engineer specific combinations around your most important individual? The Phillies chose combination over convention, and McCarver was the reason that choice produced results. Player number 2 in this story is Bob Gibson, and this is the relationship that changed Tim McCarver most fundamentally in ways that extended far beyond the boundaries of baseball. Gibson was a pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he was one of the most dominant and ferociously competitive players that sport had ever seen. He threw hard. He played with an intensity that made him genuinely difficult to be around, even for people who admired him greatly. He was also a black man who had grown up in poverty in Omaha, Nebraska, and who had spent every day of his life inside the machinery of American racism. He had no tolerance for prejudice. He was not interested in giving white teammates the time and space to slowly and comfortably evolve at their own pace. He was going to confront what he saw directly, and he was going to use every tool available to him to dismantle it. When McCarver arrived in the Cardinals clubhouse in 1959, after being signed out of high school at 17 years old, he carried with him everything that Memphis had taught him. That included the reflexive biases of a boy raised inside institutionalized segregation. His father was a Memphis police officer, a profession that in that era and that city meant being an active enforcer of the racial order. His schools were segregated. His social environment was segregated. Every institution he had ever been part of had reinforced the idea that the separation of races was natural, proper, and permanent. The prejudices McCarver brought into the Cardinals clubhouse were not positions he had reasoned his way into. They were behaviors absorbed before he had the mental tools to examine them. They lived in his language and his instincts before they ever lived in his conscious choices. Gibson and his Cardinals teammate Curt Flood looked at young players like McCarver and made a deliberate decision. They were not going to leave those biases alone. They were not going to extend patience or grace. They were going to engineer confrontation, using humor and social pressure and direct challenge in equal measure, forcing young white players to see themselves clearly whether they wanted to or not. One of their methods was a performance they repeated in front of McCarver. Gibson would approach Flood, act the part of a white man warmly greeting a black man, shake Flood's hand with exaggerated friendliness, and then immediately wipe his own hand on his pants, as if the contact had left something on him that needed to be removed. Then Gibson would turn to McCarver and ask him plainly whether he recognized that behavior, whether he had ever done something like that himself. That was not a casual question. It was a direct assault on the denial that allows people to carry prejudice while telling themselves they are decent. McCarver had behaved in ways that carried exactly that contempt. He had used language and performed actions that communicated the same disgust that Gibson was now mocking in broad daylight. Watching it performed from the outside, seeing how clearly and unmistakably ugly it looked when the social disguise was stripped away, created a crack in the certainty McCarver had carried without examination. The moment that became the most enduring symbol of McCarver's transformation happened during a spring training session on a very hot day. Gibson asked McCarver for a sip of his orange soda. McCarver flinched. It was not a thought-out reaction. It was physical, involuntary. The idea of sharing a drink with a black teammate had been installed so deeply into him by the social codes of his upbringing that his body reacted before his conscious mind had any opportunity to intervene. Gibson did not respond with anger or confrontation. He laughed. It was not a gentle laugh. It was a mocking laugh that held a mirror directly in front of what had just happened. McCarver had flinched at sharing a soda with another human being because of the color of that person's skin. When he saw that reflected back at him through Gibson's laughter, something shifted. Not completely, not all at once. But the shift was real and it kept going. The friendship that grew from that moment was not fast or easy. It was built through years of shared competition and honest discomfort and the accumulated weight of real experience. McCarver caught for Cardinals teams that won the World Series in 1964 and again in 1967 and won the National League pennant in 1968. He was behind the plate through all of it, managing Gibson's extraordinary and sometimes scorching competitive intensity, visiting the mound during games and sometimes being entirely ignored by Gibson, yet maintaining the kind of mutual trust that allowed Gibson to operate at a truly historic level. In 1968, Gibson posted an earned run average of 1.12 for the full season. In plain language, that means he gave up barely more than 1 run per 9 innings of work across an entire baseball year. That number belongs in a category by itself. McCarver was the catcher for much of that season. The partnership between them, the communication, the preparation, the psychological understanding that allowed Gibson to trust completely the man giving him signals from behind home plate was a model for the modern approach to catcher and pitcher collaboration that organizations now invest enormous resources trying to build. And then April 4th, 1968 arrived. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. In the Cardinals clubhouse, the grief arrived immediately and hit with tremendous force. For Gibson and Flood, it was not just a national tragedy, it was personal. It was the murder of a man who had given everything to the cause of people who looked like them, in the very city where the white teammate who was now standing in front of them had been raised. When McCarver approached Gibson to offer his condolences, Gibson's initial response was a wall. He told McCarver plainly that a white man from Memphis could not possibly understand the depth of what this moment meant. McCarver did not retreat. He pushed back. He acknowledged that he could not feel the pain the same way, but he made a different argument. He said that he himself was proof that people could move beyond what they had been raised to be. He pointed back to the orange soda. He pointed to the years of friendship and growth and difficult work that had followed. He was not claiming to be free from his history. He was claiming to be actively working against it, and that the work was real, and that Gibson had been the one who made it possible. That exchange solidified something that lasted more than 50 years. It turned a professional relationship into a genuine brotherhood. It endured long after both men had finished playing, long after the Cardinals dynasty had faded into history, all the way to the end of both of their lives. That bond was arguably the most important thing Tim McCarver ever built. Player number one in this story is Tim McCarver himself, and what he built on top of everything above is the final and largest piece of the picture. When McCarver moved into the broadcast booth in 1980, he was not simply changing jobs. He was carrying everything he had learned as a catcher and a teammate, and a man who had been changed by confrontation, and he was going to put it in front of a national audience in a way that had never been done before. He brought the internal logic of the catcher's position to television. Catchers see more of the game than anyone else on the field. They see the pitcher's mechanics. They see the hitter's stance and tendencies. They track every pitch, every count, every piece of information flowing from the dugout. McCarver had done that for 20 years at the highest level. Now he was going to translate it for people watching from home. His stated goal was to explain the why of baseball, not just the what. Not just the pitch, but the reasoning behind the pitch selection. Not just the defensive shift, but the hitter history and the pitch tendency data that had produced it. Not just the score, but the accumulated decision-making that had generated the score. He wanted viewers to understand the game the way a catcher understood it, from the inside out. This produced what people began calling McCarverisms. He would take considerable time explaining concepts that experienced fans considered basic. He was accused of giving viewers more detail than they had asked for, of explaining the mechanics of a clock when all anyone wanted was the time. Some fans loved this deeply, others found it exhausting and condescending. Both reactions were legitimate, but what no one could honestly dispute was his accuracy and his foresight. McCarver became the first national broadcaster to regularly predict what was about to happen on the field before it happened, and to explain his reasoning in real time as the event unfolded. His most celebrated moment of prediction came in Game 7 of the 2001 World Series. Mariano Rivera was on the mound for the Yankees. Rivera was the most respected closer in the history of the sport. Arizona needed runs to survive. McCarver identified the tactical risk of Rivera pitching inside to Luis Gonzalez. He laid out the logic clearly before the pitch was thrown, and then Gonzalez hit a broken bat blooper into shallow outfield that ended the game and gave Arizona the championship. McCarver had seen it. That was not luck. That was the product of a lifetime of baseball study and the discipline to share that knowledge under pressure in real time. His career touched all 4 major networks. He called 24 World Series total. His partnership with Joe Buck on Fox ran from 1996 through 2013 and stands as one of the most significant pairings in the history of sports media. He predicted a David Ortiz home run during the 2013 World Series moments before it occurred. He explained the mechanics of pitch framing decades before analysts had the tools to measure it. He analyzed the decline of pitching inside the strike zone using observations he had drawn from studying Sandy Koufax. He was loved and mocked and argued about for more than 3 decades on national television, and he never changed the fundamental principle he was operating from. And it is worth pausing here to understand what it actually means to call 24 World Series. The World Series is the championship of Major League Baseball. It is the final event of the year, the most watched games of the season, the moment when the sport draws its largest audience. Calling one World Series is a career achievement for most broadcasters. Calling 2 or 3 puts you in rare company. Calling 24 means that for nearly a quarter century, the people responsible for putting the biggest games in front of the biggest audiences kept choosing Tim McCarver. They kept choosing him despite the criticism, despite the McCarverisms, despite the Deion Sanders incident, despite the Mets firing. They kept choosing him because when the game was on the line and the moment mattered most, he was the one who could tell you what was about to happen before it happened and explain why and make you feel like you understood something you had not understood before. That is an irreplaceable skill. That is what kept him in that chair for nearly 3 decades at the national level. He also stood for something that was genuinely rare in the broadcast booth. He was a former player who refused to use his insider status as a shield. Most former players who move into broadcasting develop an instinct to protect the game, to protect the people in it, to be careful about criticizing from the outside what they once participated in from the inside. McCarver did not operate that way. He used his knowledge to tell the truth, not to protect the institution. That distinction is everything in sports media. It is the difference between a broadcaster who teaches you how the game works and a broadcaster who manages your perception of it. McCarver was always the first kind. That cost him. And it also made him matter. Tell the truth about what you see, even if it costs you, even if 3 buckets of cold water land on your head, even if the most storied franchise in New York shows you the door after 16 years. Keep telling the truth. That principle was not invented when McCarver walked into a broadcast booth. It was forged in a Cardinals clubhouse when a pitcher laughed at him over an orange soda and showed him what it looked like when fear hides behind social convention. It was forged on April 4th, 1968, when he had to say out loud, to a grieving man who had every reason to reject what he was hearing, that people can change, that he himself had changed, that the distance between who you were born into and who you choose to become is real distance, worth traveling however long it takes. He returned to Memphis to end his life. He went back to the beginning, not to escape from it, not to pretend the early version of himself had never existed, but to close the circle honestly. That is one of the clearest things anyone can do, to go back to where they started and to know, without flinching, everything that happened between then and now. Think about what that means for a moment. McCarver grew up in Memphis, absorbing a worldview that told him certain human beings were beneath him. He left Memphis at 17 and spent the next 60-plus years being disassembled and rebuilt by the people and the experiences and the honest confrontations that followed. He won 2 World Series rings. He led the National League in triples in 1966 with 13, a record for a primary catcher that stood as a testament to an athleticism no one expected from someone in that position. He finished second in the National League MVP vote in 1967 with a batting average of .295, the highest finish a Cardinals catcher had ever achieved in that award. He helped Steve Carlton extend a Hall of Fame career by understanding one pitch better than any other catcher alive. He said on live television what he believed needed to be said, again and again, at professional cost. And then he came home. He came back to Memphis and sat with everything that city had first given him and everything he had chosen to do differently with it. That return is not a footnote. That return is the final argument of his life, that he could go back to the place where the damage was installed and face it without shame or denial, carrying the full weight of who he had become, is as honest as a person gets. It is the thing that makes his story matter beyond baseball, beyond broadcasting, beyond any single relationship or achievement or controversy. It is the thing that makes it a human story. The tragic truth is exactly what his wife described after he was gone. Twisted fingers, chronic pain, a body that had paid the full price of a life lived at full effort in one of the most physically demanding positions in professional sport for 20 years, and then carried that price quietly for decades longer. The declining health that began in 2020 was not new. It was the surface of something that had been building for a very long time. He hid it well. He kept working. He kept showing up. But the full truth is bigger than the tragedy. The full truth is that Tim McCarver started as a product of one of the most broken social systems in American history and ended as a man who had genuinely and permanently moved beyond it. He did not accomplish that alone. He accomplished it because Bob Gibson chose confrontation over patience, because Curt Flood chose humor over silence, because a moment over an orange soda cracked something open that had been sealed shut by years of conditioning, because on the worst day of a terrible year, McCarver chose to argue for his own transformation instead of walking away from a difficult conversation, because he kept choosing that year after year for the rest of his life. The game of baseball is built on the idea that failure is constant and resilience is what matters. You fail in baseball far more than you succeed. The players who last are the ones who can lose and come back. Tim McCarver applied that same logic to the much larger project of becoming a decent human being inside a society that had not built him to be one. He failed many times. He flinched when he should have opened his hand. He said things he had to reckon with later. He carried biases that showed themselves in front of people who deserved better. And then he kept working. He kept coming back. He kept choosing to be different from what he had been. That is not a small thing. That is the biggest thing. That is the part of this story that deserves to last long after the statistics and the broadcast highlights and the ice water moments have faded into the past. That is the part worth remembering most of all. If this story reached you today, please like this video and subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Leave a comment below and tell us which part of Tim McCarver's story hit you hardest. Was it the orange soda, the meeting of the minds, the ice water on live television, the twisted fingers his wife described after he was gone? We read every single one. Tell us where this story landed for you. This man deserved to be remembered fully. Now you know why.